Thank you all for coming out. I think we have an informative presentation, and we're asking you to think of any questions, any detailed questions that you may want to know. This is the person that's going to be able to answer it. Just a little introduction. My name is Jim Zubler. I'm with downtown Lewistown. We have an organization that is working with a number of municipalities, and we have a committee that is called the Building and Sites Committee. It's been working with Granville and Derry and Lewistown Borough, and sometimes Burnham Borough as well. We welcome other municipalities to join us. We typically meet once a month, and Lewistown has been our host, just as they are tonight. So we appreciate that. But we're happy to move these kind of series or presentations to other locations. So again, I welcome you, and I also want to welcome Winnie Branton, who's with the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, and she's going to be presenting the information on land banking and also talk to us a little bit about some of the other services that the Housing Alliance provide. Winnie?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I want to, again, introduce myself. I'm Winnie Branton, and I want to tell you a little bit about the Housing Alliance's program. Okay, great, thanks. The Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania provides a land bank training and technical assistance program for municipalities. I am one of 4 trainers that go around the Commonwealth and work with municipalities that are interested in understanding what powers a land bank can use to repurpose vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties in your communities. I've been with the Housing Alliance since May of last year doing this work. Prior to that, I was in private practice as a lawyer doing environmental and land use work. I started my career at DEP in Harrisburg and spent a lot of time in Williamsport before DEP had their Williamsport office. So it's a beautiful area up here, and I'm happy to be here with you tonight. I am the program manager for the Housing Alliance's Land Bank Training and Technical Assistance Program, and I'm working with maybe 4 municipalities or groups of municipalities right now doing technical assistance as they go through the process of evaluating whether or not a land bank is an entity and an effort that they want to bring into their communities. So thanks for having me tonight. I want to start off by talking about the problem, which is blighted properties. Oftentimes you'll hear them referred to as problem properties, neglected properties. Some of those properties are tax delinquent, but not all of them are. Others are they have serious code enforcement violations, and they've been identified through different government departments and agencies as a problem property for one of those various reasons. A land bank is one of the tools that communities across Pennsylvania now can use to address those problem properties. The other, in addition to the negative aspects of blighted properties up there, one that is not listed is a loss of community cohesion, which in some of these communities, that's a big piece of it. There's a feeling like their community is just falling apart, and it impacts the way they treat their own properties, and they look for investing in other parts of their community. So that too, when you think about blighted properties, it's not just the loss of tax revenues or the impact on surrounding property values, but it's the overall loss of community cohesion that these kinds of properties can bring to communities. In 2012, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the Land Bank Act of 2012. And in that statute, they expressly stated the overriding public need to create tools for municipalities to deal with these properties. And one of the tools that they went forward and created was the ability for municipalities to create land banks. Tonight, these are the 6 questions that I want to cover, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers and further discussion. But I just wanted to lay these out so you'll get some sense of what's to come, because a lot of times when I do these presentations, it's number 5 that most people are interested in. So at the beginning, there'll be a lot of questions like, how are we going to pay for this? Because that's a real significant question, and there's not easy answers for that. So I want to give you a little bit of background on what land banks are, how they work, how they're operated, and then we'll touch on funding and how they fit in with your other Blight strategies. So what is a land bank? A land bank is really a government authority. It's much like a government authority under Pennsylvania law. The statute calls it a body, corporate, and politic, but the ones that have been created so far, they're authorities or authority-like agencies, municipal corporations, but they are known for being a single-purpose entity, and that is to do what's listed up there. You want to acquire, inventory, manage, and market those properties. And as we go through the discussion of what land banks are, you'll see how each one of those responsibilities is tied into addressing your blighted properties. So you won't think that Pennsylvania is like the first to go into this arena for land banks. There are 120 land banks, and about 120 in the United States now. They've been operating in states like Michigan and Ohio and Georgia for a number of years, and New York recently recently empowered municipalities to create land banks. So there's some history there. Pennsylvania is considered to be part of like the 3rd generation of land banks and the creation of land banks. So our statute builds on some of the other statutes from other states and their experiences in implementing land banks. So there's a lot of data and information out there on national land banks that is and was available for Pennsylvania as they went forward with their statute. Why land banks are important. Now, again, I mentioned that they're a single-purpose entity. Think about the municipal departments and agencies that deal or touch blighted properties in your communities. First of all, let me ask, how many people here are elected officials for a local government? How many people here work in code enforcement? Anybody here from the police department? Fire department? A housing authority or community development? Any realtors? Anybody who I didn't touch on, that you fit into some category that you would be touching blighted properties? Anybody? Yes?
Township manager.
Township manager, okay. Other administrators, yes?
Attorney.
Solicitors? Great. Well, just from that discussion, you see how many different departments might have some responsibility or interest in dealing with blighted properties in your communities. There's no one place at the county level, at the local level, typically, where you can get your answers to how to deal with vacant and abandoned and blighted properties, and where there's a comprehensive strategy for dealing with them, getting them, identifying them, determining whether or not they are in fact vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent, and then figuring out how to get them back into productive use. So a land bank is designed to be that single purpose entity that can be the central spot for dealing with blighted properties. Right now, it's no one's job to just do that. There are, think about blighted properties and how they fit into the larger real estate market. The reason why you have abandoned, tax delinquent, and vacant properties is because they can't be handled, or there's no interest from the normal real estate market in those properties. That's how they go through tax sale, through upset sale, judicial sale, and then maybe to the repository list. So there's no, when you think about why is that, well, number one, maybe there's no market for the property. There's no value in the property. It has a lot of liens on it. So There's no way to get that property back into the real estate market without some kind of an intervention. There are other obstacles to repurposing that property. Maybe the title is a mess and you can't find out who all the parties are that have to be notified and sign off on any kind of conveyance. So land banks are designed to be able to get rid of some of those obstacles and make it easier, more efficient, and more certain to get properties off of the vacant and abandoned and tax delinquent property lists and back into a functioning state where they're generating tax revenues and being put back to some kind of productive use. Again, the Land Bank Act itself was created to allow a uniform and systematic approach for dealing with blighted properties. Right now, you think of other strategies like your code enforcement and even eminent domain, where those are targeted at specific properties, right? It's not a system-wide approach to dealing with these kinds of properties. So the Land Bank Act was created to allow for a more systematic approach to take these properties out of the endless cycle of vacancy, tax delinquency, and abandonment. And here, this is particularly valuable in places where the short-term market for redevelopment is weak and the property can be purchased by speculators. When you have a weak real estate market, that can lead to an increase in neglected properties. And the land bank gives municipalities and local governments certain powers to try to stem that tide. Okay, how land banks are formed. Under Pennsylvania statute, there's eligible jurisdictions are defined. Counties can form land banks, municipalities with populations greater than 10,000, and then a combination of municipalities. And just looking at your communities, I know there's a good relationship between Mifflin and Juniata counties and that some of your services are shared. There's nothing that would prevent two counties from forming one land bank. To create a land bank, the governing bodies have to pass an ordinance that creates the land bank, and that ordinance sets forth what the powers are within the framework of the land bank statute. The ordinance is created, if it's a multi-municipal or county and municipalities participate, there'll be an intergovernmental cooperation agreement, and there are also filings that have to be done with the Department of State. Bylaws, certificate of incorporation is then issued. So those are your formation documents that would be prepared by your solicitor, and the Housing Alliance provides technical assistance for municipalities when you get to the point where you've decided you want to go forward and you're going to draft an ordinance. Our website has a link to pablightlibrary.com. All of the ordinances from the 7 established land banks in Pennsylvania are on that site, along with a wealth of other resources that can help to establish and then operate a land bank. The Land Bank Board governs the land bank's operations. It has to be an odd number of members from 5 to 11, and those members have to include at least one representative who is from a local community organization who lives within the land bank jurisdiction. If it's a county, it has to be a county resident. If it's a municipality, the person has to live within that municipality. The board is subject to all sunshine and ethics laws. The meetings have to be public and subject to the right to know law and all the other laws that govern transparency of government. In places that have established land banks, a lot of those boards are made up of representatives from other agencies or organizations that deal with blighted property, like a redevelopment authority or an industrial development authority or an economic development agency. And that's allowed under the statute. There can be municipal officials can sit on the board, and we encourage that because those are people who are already dealing with blighted properties, so you want to use their expertise and capacity as you create your own land bank board. Okay, here's a list of the 7 established Pennsylvania land banks. Westmoreland County was the first land bank created. It might have been Dauphin County, excluding Harrisburg. Thought I had them in order, but now that I see that, it might be the opposite. If you want to see I think Westmoreland County is the most developed of the land banks in Pennsylvania, at least for purposes of seeing how it would look if you went to their website to see what resources are there, which is the whole idea. The idea is to create a land bank that's going to market and promote these vacant properties so they get back into productive use. The Westmoreland County Land Bank has an inventory of the 10 properties that they now hold and a listing of their policies and procedures, and it's really a good reference point if you're thinking about it for your community to go there and just browse through their site to see how they have it set up. Of the 7, there's a good cross-section of eligible jurisdictions that have been the basis for the land banks. 3 are county-based, 3 are city-based, and then there's 1 multi-municipality-based, I guess multi-municipal land bank. I've been working up in the Hazleton area and did a summit up there for the greater Hazleton area on land banks. And that was one of the things they were investigating too, a multi-municipal, because there were a number of municipalities up there that had expressed some interest in it. The county-based jurisdiction seems to, at least from where I sit, and I see the problems that can arise and how things are developing, I think for most places a county-based land bank is going to be the best formation or the best jurisdiction to base it upon because of the relationship between the land bank and the county tax claim bureau. And we'll get to that later, but there are some interactions between those 2 groups, and it just makes it much easier, I think, if it was a county-based land bank. But the multi-municipal one is off to a good start too, and the city ones, I mean, Pittsburgh and Philly have resources. Harrisburg is, I think, their land banks going forward, and from what I remember last time I looked at that one, they were focusing on blighted and condemned properties and working through the redevelopment authority there. So those 3 will be interesting to watch too. As I said, Westmoreland County is pretty far along. It's administered by the County Redevelopment Authority. Right now it's limited to 10 member municipalities in its first year of operation, and it owns 10 properties. You may have seen articles recently in the news about their acquisition of the old Montsoro Medical Center in Juniata Township. It's a 7-acre parcel, and it was, if you have a chance to Google it and look at a newspaper article, there was a good article that talked about the funding sources for the project that gives you some idea of how it's not just going to be from the land bank. There's going to need there needs to be other parties involved. I think their industrial development authority or corporation was involved with some funding, and then there was other funding that was pieced together to make the property acquisition possible. The other county-based land bank that I'll talk about a little bit is Dauphin County. That's administered through their Office of Community and Economic Development. They targeted 12 smaller municipalities, but now they've opened it up to all of them. And they have 2 projects that I'm aware of that they're working on in Susquehanna Township. The first one is the ranch-style home renovation that they completed. That property is on the MLS, so it's being marketed through traditional real estate marketing efforts, and it's for sale now. They did the renovation using really creative use of inmate labor to train them in a construction apprentice program so that the inmates did the work and they received a certificate. I think it was an apprenticeship program certificate that gave them some skills and training and helped reduce the expenses of the project from the land bank. As part of your ordinance too, if you create a land bank, you'll have an opportunity to set your disposition policies, priorities of what, if the land bank acquires property and conveys it to somebody, do you want to put any priorities on what you want it to be conveyed for? Like you could say market rate rental properties, market rate home ownership properties, or you can do affordable housing, green space, whatever your community decides they'd like to use the local governments and land bank's powers to assign for giving some kind of established priorities for what the land bank acquired properties will be conveyed for. And in Dauphin County's ordinance, their priorities were first, non-tax exempt residential or commercial use at market value. They want to increase their market value properties in town. Next was less than market value, non-tax exempt residential or commercial use. Then sales to adjoining owners. Does anybody live in a municipality where there's a side lot program where if there's a vacant property that's next to a homeowner, the municipality allows that homeowner to purchase the vacant side lot for like nominal consideration? Any municipalities up here have that? It's very popular in places like Philadelphia and outside of Philadelphia in the inner ring suburbs, because a lot of times the property is, used as a dumping ground for litter, and so the municipality sells it to the adjoining owner, and that conveys, it gets the property off of the municipality's responsibilities, and it adds value to the neighborhood because now it's no longer a blighted property or a trash dump. As I mentioned, up in Northeastern Pennsylvania, there's a multi-municipal land bank. They have an intergovernmental cooperation agreement and a memorandum of understanding between them all. On the Housing Alliance's website that I mentioned, there's both of those documents are on there, which I found really interesting to see how they were going to set it up and how they were going to share responsibilities for the board and funding. So it's an interesting model. And again, the Land Bank's executive director is Pittston City's Redevelopment Authority director, so they're using existing capacity and expertise to start up their land bank. I recently saw too, and I'm trying to remember how they're funding it. I think they were going to ask each member municipality to contribute some of the gaming funds they were applying for, or to use the gaming funds that were available in that county to fund initial operations. But most of the land banks where they're having member municipalities participate, some of them are leaving the onus on funding the acquisition of a property to the municipality where the property is located. So that if you were a municipality and you said, this property's really given us trouble, we want to acquire it and redevelop it, the municipality that's a member of the land bank might be responsible for coming up with the funding to actually acquire the property in the first instance. There are a number of other, as I mentioned, I'm in a couple municipalities across the Commonwealth. There's other 3 trainers are as well. Here's a couple other, eligible jurisdiction options that are being considered. And up in out in the west, it's a TriCog. It's 3 cogs with 41 municipalities, and they're in the process of trying to form a land bank of their own. They did a blight study, I'm going to say maybe 2010, that quantified the cost of blight on their communities, and it, again, it was significant. They looked at what the cost of police and fire responses were for these properties, what the impact on the surrounding property values were, and calculated what that cost was. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but Again, that TriCog study is on the Housing Alliance's site. There's an executive summary, which is what I read, because it's pretty significant. But it gives you a good flavor of really what it costs municipalities and communities to have these problem properties in their boundaries. Okay, so now we know how land banks are formed. We know generally what a land bank is. I want to talk about what land banks can and can't do to see if those powers can be used in your communities to address the properties that you have and you want to take care of. Okay, there's 3 key land bank powers that I want to focus on. Now, the land bank statute grants land banks a wide range of powers that reflect often powers that already exist in a redevelopment authority. But there are some that are unique and special for land banks, or can be used creatively to give land banks a little bit more power than a redevelopment authority. The first one I want to talk about is the power to acquire, hold, and dispose of property. The hold piece is important because most redevelopment authorities are designed to do a specific project. They're not going to just hold property until somebody comes along to plan and develop it. The second key land bank power I want to talk about is accept and extinguish tax liens, and then the third is to quiet title to property expeditiously. So for property acquisition, you see there's there's a big list of ways generally that property can be acquired, purchased, just like anybody else. If I'm interested, if I create a land bank and there's a property that's a blighted, abandoned, vacant property, but it's not going to tax sale because the person's paying their taxes, I can offer to purchase the property and negotiate directly with the property owner. I can accept a transfer from a municipality. In Philadelphia, their land bank, the first prong of their strategic plan is to transfer city-owned properties to the land bank, and that's authorized under the statute. Donations of properties are authorized, and there's special rules that are specified in the land bank statute on the donation of tax delinquent properties. Then you have the county repository for unsold properties, and then delinquent property tax sales, which I'll get to later. And most importantly, that the legislature did not give the power of eminent domain to land banks. That's reserved for the redevelopment authorities. When I say, and I always refer repository properties, for when you get to tax enforcement, it's the upset sale, the judicial sale where the properties are sold free and clear of all liens, and then if a property makes it to judicial sale and doesn't get sold, it goes on the county repository list, just in case there anybody here who isn't familiar with those steps. The property acquisition and tax sales is what I'll talk about first. How many of you have attended an upset sale or a judicial sale in the county? So there's a number of you that have gone through that process. Tax delinquent properties can be a key source for land bank property acquisition. Now it says up there often in most blighted properties. I mean, I've looked at some research where they try to see whether or not tax delinquent properties are usually blighted. Some aren't. Some tax delinquent properties, they're not neglected, they're just tax delinquent. They're in a community where nobody's breaking in to strip the pipes or throwing rocks at the windows, and that's fortunate. But the fact that there's a tax delinquent property or multiple tax delinquent properties in a neighborhood suggests that there's trouble on the horizon if it isn't already there. So to acquire properties at tax sales requires close coordination with the County Tax Claim Bureau. And I'm going to describe for you how the statute authorizes land banks to acquire properties at a judicial sale, especially. As I said, land banks have special powers to acquire properties at judicial sale. At the judicial sale, to set up a judicial sale, the Tax Claim Bureau petitions the court to sell properties that were not purchased at the upset sale. The upset sale is a sale where tax delinquent properties are sold at a bid that covers the cost of the taxes. If you purchase at an upset sale, you're purchasing subject to whatever mortgages and private liens are on the property. The only thing that gets taken care of at the upset sale are delinquent taxes. If a property isn't sold at the upset sale, it then is listed for a judicial sale, and again, a petition is filed with the court, and the court authorizes the sale of the properties on the list at minimum bids, and those purchases are free and clear of liens that are on the property. Not everything. Federal liens aren't discharged. You have to negotiate that separately if you have something with the IRS or the federal government. And then they say ground rents, which I believe are limited to like mobile home parks, but I'm not sure. But that's always separated out as not being covered by free and clear title when you do that. At the judicial sale, you might be able to bid on a property that for $1,000, let's say, at the county judicial sale. But the assessed value of that property may be $50,000. Those judicial sales are typically organized as a public auction where if buyers satisfy some minimum criteria, they can come in and bid on properties that are listed for judicial sale. To get an idea of how these sales operated in the communities near where I live, I registered for one in Delaware County. It was in May. I went, there were 600 properties on the judicial sale list when it first went out. And it's an auction. You know, there's a room is filled with people, and people are there. They've looked at the properties from the outside because you can't get in. And there's little information given about the properties other than what you can find, you know, publicly through the internet and other sources. And then it goes to the highest bidder. A party can purchase or pay their taxes and get it off the list up to the time the gavel falls in most counties. They want the homeowner to stay there is usually the priority. It's not to get rid of them, but they need to collect their taxes. The sales are set up to collect delinquent taxes, not to give real estate investors or others opportunities to buy properties at low cost. It's really to get back to the municipalities what's owed to them and what they haven't been paid for the taxes. So under the land bank statute, a land bank can negotiate in advance of the judicial sale with the Tax Claim Bureau to purchase properties that are identified as being on the judicial sale list. They can negotiate an agreement to buy the property in advance of the sale and without competitive bidding. All of that has to be done, though, in conjunction with the taxing authorities. So a land bank may look at the judicial sale list and say, wow, that property's on there. That's a great spot for this nonprofit organization to expand their affordable rental properties. We want to help them get that property and develop it with that end use. And then the land bank negotiates that with the County Tax Claim Bureau after getting agreement from the taxing authorities that whatever the sale price is acceptable to them. Now, it doesn't mean that the land bank is going to negotiate with the Tax Claim Bureau to get the property for $0. I mean, the idea would be that you'd try to be getting it for nominal consideration. But in some places, I know the municipalities are so strapped for cash that even properties that aren't generating any revenue, if there's a chance for them to get something, they want to try to have that opportunity. So I've talked with some Tax Claim Bureau lawyers and people that practice frequently in that area about the ability to have an agreement whereby the taxing authorities were paid the owed taxes maybe at the time the land bank conveys it to another party for development. or that it's at the minimum bid price, which would be $1,000. You assume that some of the properties are not going to be sold. Some will be. Some will be popular, and they'll be likely to generate more than one bidder and for a price higher than the minimum bid. I did take a look at the last one that was here in Mifflin County, and there were 76 properties on the upset sale list, and then 22 went to judicial sale. So it's not a giant portfolio of properties here, but that's a good number, and that would, those 22 properties that are on the judicial sale list in Mifflin County, a land bank here could look at that list and say, we want to acquire that property. We don't want to go through competitive bidding. We can negotiate an agreement with the Tax Claim Bureau, subject to the approval of the taxing authorities, and acquire the property. And I'll give you an example of how this would have helped a municipality that now has a land bank, and it's the city of Pittston. There was a property on their Main Street that they wanted to develop as part of their Main Street project. An investor came to the tax claim sale and outbid the redevelopment authority for the property. The property sat for another 3 years because the purchaser didn't have the resources to really develop it, and the redevelopment authority then purchased it 3 years later. But if there had been a land bank, the land bank could have contacted the Tax Claim Bureau, negotiated a deal, and wouldn't have had to wait another 3 years while the property continued to decline. The other interesting part about property acquisition through judicial sale is that the statute talks about consideration not having to be in dollars. It can be non-monetary consideration, meaning you could have, under your agreement, consideration that would be you were going to maintain the property for a certain number of years. You were going to develop it for a certain purpose. It wouldn't necessarily have to be for $1,000. And that's authorized under the land bank statute for the agreement to not have to follow or not have to provide for what people normally think about as actual monetary price dollars consideration. The other thing I want to mention about the free and clear title, in talking to title companies and solicitors for different municipalities, their concern is that after you go through the judicial sale and you take the property, you're getting it by court order. It says it's free and clear, but that is dependent upon whether or not all of the interested parties that had any interest in the property received proper notice of the sale. So in order to get title insurance, the title insurance company has to be comfortable with the process that preceded the judicial sale of the property to make sure that everybody in the chain of title who had an interest in the property was properly notified of the sale, so that there won't be any challenges or difficulties later. So it's important that a land bank, if a land bank does acquire a property at judicial sale, that, as I'll talk about later, it has the right and the opportunity to seek to quiet title to those properties it acquires in an expeditious manner. And just going back to the Delaware County experience, I laugh because within 48 hours of my registering and attending the sale, after I attended the sale, within 48 hours, I received 3 letters from different law firms who must just look at the registered parties list, telling me that even though I bought it at judicial sale and I got free and clear title, that I should still file a quiet title petition with the court because I couldn't really rely on the county's ability to properly notify everybody. So as an added precaution, that was what was recommended as what the proper course of proceedings would be if you purchased that judicial sale. As I mentioned before, a land bank can hold property. It can acquire it, but can also hold it for later development. As I said too, redevelopment authorities typically don't do that or can't do that. They need to get it back up quickly. But here, if you have let's say you have a community where you have a strategic plan or a community plan that talks about a comprehensive plan that has identified an area that you want to develop in a certain way, and a property becomes available, but you're not ready to do anything with the surrounding properties yet, you have an opportunity through your land bank to acquire it and hold it until some point in time where you're able to develop it. So it allows for a longer term planning for land use. Property disposition is the third. So you have acquisition, holding, and now property disposition. Laws that restrict some municipalities on disposing of real property don't apply to land banks. A land bank, as I said before too, you can sell, transfer, lease, mortgage, etc. Any amount and or form of consideration. This is the phrase that I love the most. It determines to be appropriate. So there's much flexibility built into the statute that allows land banks to engage in property disposition strategies that work for what the community's priorities are. And there's no requirement that when a land bank conveys property for development, there's no need for a redevelopment agreement like you would have if you were dealing with a redevelopment authority. Now, having said that, it's not needed, but in Philadelphia, there's still going to be an agreement if you acquire from the land bank. And other communities are going to do the same thing because you want to ensure that the party that you're conveying to is conveying, or is acting with respect to the property in accordance with what you understood their plans were from the beginning. So you don't need a formal redevelopment agreement that has different requirements and criteria, but you're going to still want to have some kind of agreement for most properties with whoever's acquiring it from you. So, given the flexibility and the wide range of powers that a land bank has for property disposition, the legislature built in some protections. One is that, and the most, again, highlighting the need for a transparent process with ample opportunity for community input. The inventory of properties that is acquired and held by the land bank has to be publicly available. Most communities are going to do it through a website. But you can also, I mean, some of them are not, so they'll just have that inventory available for people to look at. And then policies and priorities are clearly established, and they're part of the community planning and local engagement process. The land bank statute itself talks about using approved community plans and land use plans to guide land bank's acquisition strategies. So there's an understanding that there'll be coordination and cooperation between county and local planning and a land bank's acquisition strategies and disposition strategies. Property disposition again. A land bank can set priorities for who purchases the property. For instance, in Cuyahoga County Land Bank, Cuyahoga County's in Ohio, they have a disposition policy that opens up acquisition to homeowners first, because they want owner occupancy to increase. So they've developed a strategy that is intended to increase owner occupancy in that county. It's only for a set period of time, and then it goes open to the full public. A land bank can also set priorities for the end use of the property conveyed. As I mentioned, it can be conveyed for affordable housing, public spaces, industrial uses. In Philly, the city council person who was holding the hearings on their strategic plan expressed concern initially to make sure that the land bank wasn't going to come in and start pushing for rezoning of different areas and gentrifying different areas at the expense of continuing or expanding industrial uses. So you can set those priorities and policies through the governing bodies and the ordinances that you would create to establish a land bank. The next power of a land bank that I want to talk about is the power to extinguish tax liens. You can discharge liens on property it acquires, but again, it's subject to the approval of the taxing authorities. And here, think about a property that is just weighed down with liens. It's vacant and neglected, and it's never going to be taken care of in the regular real estate market. You need to get rid of those tax liens so that the liens no longer exceed the value of the property. A land bank can do that with the powers given to it under the land bank statute. And the way a land bank would extinguish liens, the board has to pass a resolution, and the resolution has to indicate that the taxing authorities signed off on the discharge of those liens. The next power I'm going to talk about is the power to quiet title to property expeditiously. Tangled titles are an impediment and an obstacle to vacant property development. Land banks, under the statute, are authorized to bring quiet title proceedings that cover more than one property. So you could come in to common pleas court with a petition to quiet title that would cover 10 properties, let's say, if the land bank required there's a judicial sale. And under the statute, a hearing, I think there has to be a judgment within 120 days, and I think the hearing has to be within 90 days of the petition being filed. But again, that's under the statute. Common pleas courts, they operate under their own rules, so it's there on the books, and we hope that it'll be implemented through the county courts to ensure that land banks can get expeditiously the quiet title proceedings completed. Because in order to market those properties, the land bank needs to have clear and free title in order to be able to repurpose those properties. So I've talked about what a land bank can do, and I want to just really highlight, which you probably have already picked up on, that land banks can't operate unilaterally. For almost all the powers that are unique to land banks, for each one of those powers, I think I've said, they need approval of the taxing authorities in order to identify certain properties for acquisition or even to dispose of properties. The governing bodies that set up and draft the ordinance can specify how that happens. In Philadelphia, City Council will still need to approve the disposition of properties by the land bank that are valued in excess of, I think it could be as low as $50,000. So there's still a way for the governing bodies, the local governments, the taxing authorities to impact how a land bank can operate. It doesn't operate unilaterally. Some of the other partners that you want to think about are nonprofit organizations in your communities that are involved in redevelopment of properties. In Montgomery County, there's Habitat for Humanity in Montgomery County. They acquire vacant properties and they redevelop them for homeowners. They also get the vacant lots and build new homes on those. So there are nonprofits in your community that might be interested too in partnering with the land banks, and they're needed partners. And again, here, some others, economic development agencies. There's not a redevelopment authority in Mifflin County, correct? And is there an industrial development authority? Okay. And is there any economic development agency that's separate from the industrial development authority? Yeah? Okay. And then tax claim bureau, of course, and then the school districts. I mean, I've talked about taxing authorities, but the school district is a key piece in these negotiations, because when you look at your tax bill, I don't know about every county, but where I live, most of it's going to the school districts. And that is the biggest chunk, and the school districts have to be educated on land banks and how the use of land banks and their powers to acquire these properties and repurpose them will wind up generating new revenues for the school district. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show you some slides I did for Hazleton that shows what those numbers are and what dollars can be recovered as a means to try to educate school board members and school board administrations about land banks. In the packets that were distributed, there's a handout that talks about how land banks can be funded that I recently did. And there's one, before I get started, I want to point out the one that is missing on there. I don't know how it fell off of it, but under the land bank statute, land banks are authorized to be allocated up to 50% of the tax revenues for up to 5 years for a property that they convey out and repurpose. So if I'm a land bank and I buy 123 Market Street, I redevelop it and I sell it, for the 5 years after I sell it, I, as the land bank, can receive up to 50% of the tax revenues from that property. And that is referred to sometimes as the 550 recapture provision, and it was meant to give some resources to land banks. Because as you see up there, there's no funding provided under the Land Bank Act that enables municipalities to create land banks. So there's no dedicated source of revenue that each municipality that forms a land bank is going to get in order to establish it and then operate it. The way that a lot of the municipalities that are moving forward are doing it is they're using existing capacity through their redevelopment authorities, the departments of community and economic development, and their industrial development boards. A land bank can also they can share staffing, share all kinds of resources, and all of that's authorized under the statute. Again, funding. First one, I'll put on there 550 share of property taxes collected. But think about startup. That money's not here now. If you want to start a land bank, you got to figure out how am I going to get my money to start it and how much am I going to need. Proceeds from sales and leases, again, you don't have that money now, right? So you can't use that for your startup. Contribution from municipalities. For Westmoreland County, for the member municipalities, they require a $5,000 annual fee to be paid by each member municipality. And that was intended to give them some resources for startup. Not all, they had other resources that they used. Next is grants and loans from public and private sources. Some communities are lucky where there might be a foundation or a nonprofit that is generous with resources to municipalities. Not many are available in Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh has some. They'll probably get foundation funding for their startup of their land bank, and other communities are looking into that, but it's not really a likely source for most municipalities that are forming land banks. So the private sources like that are not really, I don't think, going to be a real big piece across the Commonwealth. Gaming funds for those counties that have casinos. You don't have a casino, you don't have any of that money, right? Impact, you get Act 13 impact fees? No. And the Housing Trust Fund, CDBG, and then other DCED programs, Keystone Communities Program. I think there's a couple others on that list. But those are really the public grants and loans that the 7 established land banks have been cobbling together to give them enough money to start their land banks. Under the statute, land banks are authorized to issue bonds. None of the land banks are talking about issuing bonds because they have to be revenue bonds, so you'd have to demonstrate the revenue in order to pay back the bonds, and right now nobody's at that stage yet. And then, of course, income from any investments that a land bank might make, but that's down the pike too. So the funding is complicated, and it's difficult, and it's an obstacle for some communities to move ahead and form land banks. But I want to share with you a couple of options that some communities have used, and see if that touches any levels of interest up here. One I want to talk about is Chautauqua County, New York. It's a rural community that formed a land bank back in 2012, and their land bank is administered through their county planning and economic development department. It's featured in and I'll give you the resource, a link to it, but there's an organization called the Center for Community Progress. It's a national organization. All they deal with is repurposing vacant land and properties across the United States. They did a national study that highlighted 7 different land banks to give some idea of how different communities are handling it. And Chautauqua was one of the featured 7 in that report. and there's a lot of information in there that is really useful and helpful in a lot of counties in Pennsylvania because they have similar demographics. The difference is that in New York, their state is funding and giving funding to different county-based land banks. So they have other resources that we don't have. But here's an image that shows you their budget, or it gives you some idea of their inventory and staff size. In 2012, they had 18 properties, and they had only one shared and one full-time employee. They had 11 board members, and they were trying to average 12 property acquisitions a year. It shows their revenue for 2013 as $400,000, but as you'll see in the next slide, I'll come back to that. If you see in this slide, that's not really that clear, but the $400,000 included the assessed or appraised value of the properties that they acquired. So it really wasn't revenue that they took in. It was looking at what the value of those properties were. So this isn't a big operation. 18 properties, one full-time, one shared employee. And to talk what is known now for using what's called an ABC acquisition approach. In New York, like in PA, land banks have certain powers to acquire tax delinquent properties. How they describe it is that they want to gradually grow their inventory and manage their properties on a small scale initially to get things started. So they designed a scheme where Type A properties are marketable properties that have equity. Type B might require some little initial investment, but they're more or less marketable. And then Type C are the ones that are never going to be marketable. They'll be any structures will be demolished, and they'll be used as a side yard or maybe for parking after that's done. So looking at those three types of properties, what they do is they acquire a limited number, and I think it's 3, 2, 1. ABC goes with 3, 2, 1. They acquire 3 Type A properties at tax sale, and then their business plan calls for them to also acquire then, say, 2 Type B properties and 1 Type C property. And that's how they design their model to make it work for them, so that they would use the revenue that they generate from the sale of the Type A properties and Type B properties after their rehab to allow them to deal with the Type C properties. And you can see in year 1, their revenue and expense model was based on 6 acquisitions, 3 A, 2 B, and 1 C. And so that's where, that's a bad slide. But you can see their total expenses for the first year was only $30,000. So it wasn't a huge undertaking for Chautauqua County in terms of their larger budget. And a lot of that was achieved by shared capacity. And here's what I'd like to show too. Here's some before and after pictures from Chautauqua. And you can see how the before picture and the after picture. Now, I look at that and I'm like, okay, it looks, of course it looks prettier, it looks better. But then when you look at the numbers, that's where it really impacts. And it went from being appraised at $13,000 to being appraised at $190,000. Then you're going to the next one. Here's another one that they had success with. It was appraised initially at $16,000, and when it sold, it was appraised at $80,000.
Excuse me, is it assessed different than appraised though?
Yeah.
Appraised is market value, assessed is what
the taxes are, right? And then for this last one too, I think that was one that they haven't completed yet, but it too was on its way to being appraised at a much higher value and being assessed at a higher value, thereby generating additional taxes that were actually going to be collected instead of just be on the books. So funding is a challenge, there's no doubt about it. If you can figure out a way to share capacity with existing organizations or agencies that deal with blighted properties, and you can see how the use of those powers would help your community to address properties that you want to get back on the books and back into productive use. Then here, I just want to talk briefly about how land banks fit into your larger strategies for dealing with blight. The Housing Alliance likes to think of land banks as one leg in a three-legged stool, and the other two legs are your property code enforcement, and then a reinvestment strategy that's going to get those properties back into productive use and in the marketplace. But again, too, a land bank doesn't want to acquire every blighted property in the community. They're not designed that way. Land banks are a tool where you want to use them in a targeted way. You want to have a strategy that would focus on a particular area or particular properties and use those powers of a land bank to get those back in to productive use, because they're just, especially for new operations like a land bank, you don't want to start and take on more than you can accomplish in the short term. First of all, land banks are a new thing in Pennsylvania, right? So people are going to be looking at the land banks and saying, oh, I knew this wasn't going to work, this was a land grab, these people are crazy, it's another big government entity that really isn't necessary and isn't accomplishing what we wanted to accomplish. So for those communities that are considering starting a land bank, we recommend that you start small so that you can establish your successes and have a project that is successful so you can point to it and say, here's what we've done, here's why we want your support, and here's why we think land banks are a good part of our strategy to deal with these types of properties. And a land bank, too, holds the property tax exempt while it holds it just like a local government would. So a land bank in some communities doesn't want to hold on to the properties too long because, again, the property is being held by the land bank. It's not generating any revenue, and your real property taxes are the lifeblood of local governments. I mean, so you're inspired and you're purposed to get those properties back to some use that's going to benefit your community. I'll talk briefly about a couple other, the other two legs of the stool. One is code enforcement, and you know, there are a whole bunch of strategies that communities use for code enforcement and to prevent and eliminate blighted properties in their communities. Do your communities generally follow the International Property Maintenance Code? Is that common up here? And then in some communities, they found that quality of life violation ticketing ordinance has helped in Allentown. I know they did that where there's, you know, start with a warning and then you move up the chain. The idea isn't necessarily to punish, but to really to get the violations corrected. Because if they're not corrected and the property becomes blighted, it just, you know, it's a cycle ending up in the municipality's lap. So that's the idea behind those. I know there's many communities use rental, vacant, and foreclosed property registrations. I think, Jim, when we talked, you were telling me about the rental property registration. Is that ordinance in development here?
It's in consideration.
And then any vacant property ordinances in any of the municipalities nearby? Or like if there's a foreclosure action, any ordinances that require the lender to register with the municipality? No. Those are a couple other options that other communities have used, especially those where there's a lot of foreclosures. They want to have clear contact information for the banks and the lenders so that if there's a problem, they can get in touch with them. And they also want to put some pressure on them to make sure they maintain the property while it goes through the foreclosure process. Other things up there are common too, requirements for tax sale bidders. They can't be tax delinquent or have code violations. Ordinances that specify, you know, maximum amount of time you can go to correct code violations. And then, you know, permit denials, fines, criminal enforcement. They're all part of usually a community's comprehensive code enforcement strategies for properties. The second, or the last leg is the reinvestment strategy. And that's where you're trying to return the properties to the marketplace. And it's important to have a strategy for that too, and use your economic development agencies and all the other partners that I've mentioned in trying to get properties back into use. And the land banks is designed to assist with land assembly and manage the inventory and, you know, look out for new markets for those properties. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but the Housing Alliance last year released a comprehensive manual for municipalities called Blight to Bright. And in that manual, there's a slew of strategies to address all different kinds of blighted properties, from land banks to conservatorship to you know, permit denials. And a link to that is also at that site, blightlibrary.com. And Jim, we had talked, you said that there were some conservatorship petitions have been filed in the counties up here.
Yes.
Has anybody in the audience filed a conservatorship petition? You have? And was it a successful use of that statute?
That's really easy.
It's still undergoing?
Yeah, we have one where we were just in court at the end of December. The judge just recently signed the petition giving the Borough Lewistown conservatorship. So we'll see how that does. But like I think most throughout Pennsylvania, these are generally the properties that would be demolished rather than actually rehabbed and sold.
Yeah, it's there was a the Housing Alliance had a roundtable call on Friday on conservatorships, and there were a number of people on the call who were doing the petitions, and there's one lawyer in Philly who's done, I think, 50 petitions, and most of those properties aren't for demolition, they're for rehab, but there's now, like, he was describing what was necessary to get that off the ground, and for those who may not be familiar with conservatorship, but you're actually going into court and asking the court to appoint a third party as the conservator of a property that's, you know, neglected and blighted and isn't being managed properly by the owner. But there's a state law that specifies the criteria for your eligibility to even seek a conservatorship. But they were talking about the process of educating the judges on the statute and how the conservatorship is necessary in order to, you know, implement municipality strategies for dealing with blighted properties. So if you have a chance after this, I'd like to ask you a couple questions about your petition. That'd be great. Anybody else? So that's another strategy that's discussed in the Blight to Bright toolkit. So if you're interested in these issues, it's a great resource. And we've talked, I mean, I think I've given you enough details about what a land bank can do, can't do, and how to fund the land bank, at least to get you thinking about this as an option. And I wanted to just highlight some considerations that communities look at before they decide to go forward or as they're considering it. One is you want to look at what tools do we have already in place and how are we using them? You know, are we addressing blighted properties with tools that are working, and is there a need to have another tool? Secondly, have an idea of what your blighted property inventory is, like how many blighted properties are in my jurisdiction. Are they all located in a particular area? Are there conditions in that area that are contributing to the blight? Just to get some information and data that can help inform your strategies for dealing with it. And then last, you want to look at the costs and benefits of operating a land bank. There's costs, as you can see from the budgets of the other communities, but the benefits too, you look at what impact blighted properties and what costs are already being imposed on municipalities by these properties. And then you see if they balance out. Are we losing more money on these blighted properties than it would cost for us to develop a new strategy and a new tool for addressing them? But those are all considerations that the local communities would look to as they go through evaluating the need for a land bank. And when you look at what added values a land bank might provide, here's The biggest one that I think is there is you're removing barriers to the redevelopment of vacant properties. I know in more densely populated communities, the title and entangled title is really an impediment. Developers come in and they say, I won't be able to get title insurance on this group of parcels. I'm not interested. There's plenty of other properties out there for them to develop, so immediately it's a barrier for them. They're not coming in. They're not going to take on that project. Second, that most municipal officials are concerned with, and rightly so, is by repurposing the blighted properties, you're going to increase your tax revenues by just on that one property that's not paying taxes, but also on the surrounding properties, because there are studies that, I'm happy to share their resources with you that just chronicle what the costs are to surrounding properties of one blighted property on the block or in the neighborhood. And it was way more significant than I thought until I started to look at it, and it really has an impact. The other one's job creation. I want to touch on that just because I found the Dauphin County's land bank project so interesting, to try to use the land bank and its efforts to give job training and provide, short-term job opportunities for incarcerated guys at the county prison. So this is some of the considerations of added value that communities make when they're looking at, would a land bank provide any added value for us? Here's the slides that I mentioned about tax revenues. I took a look at the Luzerne County judicial tax sale properties, and I looked at a property that had an assessed value of $50,000. Without a land bank and looking at a 10-year period, that one property, it was a negative $10,000 in taxes if things just continued as they were. Blighted property, tax delinquent, not generating any taxes. And I did the 5 years because, as you'll see in the next slide, I wanted to show what, even with the 50% tax revenue sharing that a land bank gets, after the 5 years, or during the 5 years, how much new tax revenue will come to the taxing authorities. And then for the next 5 years, the taxing authorities get 100%, just to show in a 10-year period what that one property would contribute if there was a land bank or if it otherwise got repurposed. So take a look here. This shows if the land bank purchased the property in 2014, just even looking at Hazleton City, over those 5 years, or 10 years, Hazleton City would have another $2,500. Now that number seems small. It looked small to me when I was looking at it. I'm like, this is one property in a municipality that has a significant number of tax delinquent properties. If you go here, this is the final one, where you look at tax revenues gained by repurposing that tax delinquent property through the land bank. Now this assumes that after the property is redeveloped and conveyed, that it's assessed at $75,000, and that's very, that was conservative. When I looked at it, I looked at other properties to see, how they change after they're redeveloped. Is a $75,000 assessment common in Hazleton? And it was pretty consistent with other properties. And you see that the difference over 10 years was $10,000, $10,700. And then you see without the land bank and without repurposing that property, it's zero. The school district gets zero as long as the property stays in that condition. Same way as the other taxing authorities. So when you take a look at individual properties that could have otherwise been redeveloped through by using tools like a land bank, you can see that the dollars are there, and the dollars are being lost by leaving those economic assets, those public assets, without any collection. And here, just a couple final notes on, blight remediation is certainly the central focus of land banks and strategies for repurposing properties, but they also have some beneficial side consequences. Here, as again I mentioned, this was the Dauphin County project, and they earned pre-apprentice certificates in construction. That was one. And then in Philadelphia, their land bank proposed strategic plan is using vacant properties for their stormwater management requirements. And Philadelphia already has that obligation, so they're taking vacant property, which is not being used to its fullest purpose or highest purpose, and now they're trying to figure out ways to use those vacant and non-marketable properties to satisfy their existing obligations for stormwater management. And I just want finally to focus on some of the key points that I'd like to leave tonight with. And the first one is that, land banks have powers and they create opportunities. And that it's best to think of them not as a new government entity, because I know there's pressure on many counties not to create new entities that require feeding with dollars and resources over time. It starts small, but then 10 years from now, you'll see it's this giant monolith that, has gone beyond what it was originally intended to be. So if you think of how and ways that you can use a land bank's power, but not, go overboard by creating a new government entity. And as I said earlier, it's through using existing capacity through other government agencies, your departments of community and economic development, your planning departments, your redevelopment authorities. And then again, remember that a land bank's not going to take all of the blighted properties and deal with all those. You want a targeted, purposeful acquisition and disposition strategy. Partnerships are key. All those entities have to be part of the planning and running of a land bank. And then last is land banks are no silver bullet. It's just one additional tool that you can use to try to return these community assets, which are the vacant properties, back to some kind of productive use. And today I was reading another article about land banks, and they described tax liens as a public asset, or they talked about tax liens on private properties as a public asset, and to think about those in terms of a public asset that's sitting there and it's not, you can't use it because there's no collection, there's no repurposing, there's no use of that property to either satisfy land use goals for affordable housing or for green space, or to generate tax revenues and keep a property, moving forward and being sustainable and enjoyable at a place where, you'd want to live. So I'm happy to answer any questions or, if there's any comments that anybody wants to make or contribute, I'm happy to listen to. Has anybody here ever attended a presentation on land banks before from the Housing Alliance or anyone else? So this is new up here pretty much. Has either county ever done a blight study or part of its comprehensive plan identified blighted properties?
That was going to be my question. The TriCog that you had mentioned, how did they go about the study? How did they get the study?
They had funding from, I think, I want to say the Ford Foundation, or like a big foundation to assist them. And it was done over a number of years to look at all the blighted properties in the communities and try to calculate what those costs are. But a lot of it is so data focused that if you have the data, it's easy to do a lot of this analysis. In Philly, they did what's called a market value analysis of the blighted and vacant properties to see, are there certain parts of the city that there's a lot of market activity, so those are going to be able to be taken care of by the market. This area is like kind of in between, where you wouldn't call it an emerging market yet, but there's signs of delinquency and blight. And then you have the third, where it's like the landlords and property owners are not investing in their properties because they will never get a return on that investment. So trying to figure out where it's most effective to use a land bank and to do targeted code enforcement. It's the same kind of thinking that you want to try to impact the broader market. Maybe the best way to impact that is by going into that middle community where it's not yet fully blighted and it's in the process of maybe emerging, and you want to give it a little push so that you can expand out that successful market and that functioning market to include a bigger piece of your community. So, but yeah, the blight study and gathering that data, it's so useful to have it. And some municipalities have it just by who's paying their water bills, who's not paying their water bills, who's paying their trash collection fees, like all those liens that may be on properties. They're in different parts of the government, so the process of collecting all that data and putting it at one spot is sometimes an obstacle for a thorough evaluation of your blighted properties. But in McKean County and some other counties where the Housing Alliance is working, there's a simple way that we've addressed it, and that is to ask communities to identify properties that they're familiar with. There are community organizations and residents who fully know which properties are causing trouble, and the police certainly know if there's responses or fires or break-ins. There are resources that are available that aren't expensive to use to collect that data. It's just the process of having somebody interview and review that information in order to coordinate it for a strategy. So, okay. Well, I will. Okay.
We talked about kind of a carrot or a stick philosophy, and within the past couple of years, we were able to work on several properties with rehab and address it from the standpoint when the property was repaired, it was up to code on the exterior. You had mentioned, as far as funding options, kind of a vacant property assessment or a vacant property fee. What would be an average fee potentially for a property? In other words, to try to get some of these property owners that are just sitting on properties and not doing anything, and it's contributing to the decline in the neighborhood. That could be one way to help jumpstart it. What kind of fee?
I can't give you an average, but I've seen a model where what they have is an escalating fee. Like for the first year that it's vacant, you pay X dollars. If it's vacant for a second year, it's 2 times X. If it's vacant for a third year, it's 3 times X, so that there's a greater incentive with each year that passes for the owner of the vacant property to try to do something with it. I can certainly find out like an average, but off the top of my head, I don't know the average, but I know that's what I've seen in some of the vacant property registration ordinances, because they want to. It's supposed to be encouragement to get you to do something with the property, not let it sit there.
And that could target both, a single family type of house, as well as it could also go to a rental property. So it would not discriminate
No,
between
it
either
applies
of those two
to whoever the vacancy is. Anybody else? Yes?
From what I gather here, I don't see anything here that's going to be short-term, is it?
Short-term relief for blighted properties?
Yeah, to get these projects going, to get them acquired, and to get them sold. I'm looking at 4, 5, 10 years.
Well, I mean, maybe to feel a real impact, but Westmoreland County, they already have properties that they've acquired, 10 properties, and they're redeveloping. Dauphin County Land Bank has at least the one that they started very small. I think their first year they were only going to have 3 properties. The one they've already rehabbed, and now it's on the market to be repurposed, and the other one is in the process of getting the necessary permits to go forward. So, I mean, if you're asking, long term, do you need to be patient and see like a big impact? I think the answer is yes, but certainly short term, these tools can be used to address individual properties like Dauphin County and Westmoreland County are doing. So I think it really depends on what your needs are. If you have a huge inventory of blighted properties in your community, a land bank doesn't want to take all those at once, because you do really want to start small.
And the initial startup costs come from where?
Well, that's, sometimes it's contributions from municipalities, and I think that's going to be common if there are county land banks that are created, and it's kind of an opt-in process for municipalities that want to participate, because a lot of the municipalities don't have the capacity alone to do it, but they're willing to contribute something in order to be part of a larger group effort. So I think that's, you know, that's where part of it's going to come, but that's, even if you charge $5,000 and you have 10 member municipalities, like in Westmoreland County. In fact, I have their budget. That only was $50,000 of their first year budget, which was $390,000. But what Westmoreland County did was they shared, their redevelopment authority covered the salaries of their people to run the land bank. They had $150,000 of CDBG Act 13 money. They had, where did they get any foundation grants? They got a loan also from the redevelopment authority of $50,000. So, and they had a foundation grant of $19,000. So they also anticipate, oh, you know what, the other interesting piece they did, but that's not going to generate a lot either, is they had a little transaction fee on conveyances from the land bank to a buyer. And that was going to generate $7,500, assuming they conveyed out 10 purchases. I think it was a minimum fee of $750 per transaction. TriCog, in their business plan, they're doing a, what people are referring to as like a scrape of the tax delinquency fees that are paid. But again, that all has to be negotiated with all the school districts and all the taxing authorities, and that's 41 municipalities. I mean, I've been following that just because it's interesting from the perspective of local government and municipal government to try to get agreement from 41 municipalities, 3 COGs, and think of all the school districts involved. So that's really an undertaking, but they successfully did the Blight study together, and they work on other projects together, so they have relationships that they can work on. But where I was thinking, wow, that's really an undertaking. But that's, I mean, you look at Westmoreland County, and that's just for 10 transactions, and their budget was, you know, $390,000 the first year of operations, and that had loans and member contributions, but also use of CDBG dollars, which some communities don't want to use for blighted properties. They have other projects that they usually direct that money to. So funding is definitely a problem, and it doesn't look like in this next legislative session that there's going to be new funding for local governments for any project. So we're not moving ahead anticipating that there'll be some new revenue source to rely on. It's really try to figure out how you can use existing capacity and then pull in other resources that are authorized under the statute for use.
You mentioned Keystone Communities.
Yeah.
And that is certainly something that, you know, we're pulling our resources together and, you know, bringing that to it. That could be, you know, something if municipalities want to, you know, take a look at it, or the county as a whole.
Right, and I think for that, PHFA or DCD, one of those said that you could use it for acquisition properties, but not for operations. Like, you couldn't use it for the administrative operation, but there are ways that you can figure that out and shift money from different resources. But yeah, those are the options that you have. Yes?
It just seems to me that I can't just tell you what anyone here can just tell me how many blighted properties we have in this community, this county. That inventory is really the key to getting this thing started. If we don't have but one, we're not going to start a land bank.
Yeah, you don't need a land bank.
If we have 10, are we going to start a land bank? Oh, maybe fall 10 or on 3rd Street, that might be different.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things we have to do. Getting the money to operate this whole thing, I think we need to understand what is this?
For sure.
Where are we at?
That's your first, that would be, that's the first question that you have to think of, like, do we have a problem with blighted properties?
Yeah.
The only way you know that is if you do at least some kind of, even if it's just a preliminary inventory.
And that's something I think that we have in this community. We have to figure that out. I don't have to figure out where I'm going to get the money to run a land bank. I better figure out if I got a problem.
Yeah, because if you don't have a problem.
You all know that. Now, I'm sure the township supervisors and borough managers all know that, but do they know it collectively?
Right. And maybe the borough manager thinks these 10 properties are blighted. Maybe the police think these 10 properties are blighted. And the code enforcement guy is saying it's these 20 properties over in this neighborhood that are blighted. So there's no one place where all this is coordinated. In some communities that are in the process of dealing with blighted properties, they'll form a blighted property task force. It's like informal. It's not that blighted property review committee or that has any. It's just a regular meeting of people that are interested in sharing information about blighted properties to get to the point where you have a better sense of what is out there that needs to be addressed.
How big is this?
Yeah. Because land banks aren't needed in every community. I'll be the first. In fact, the Housing Alliance's program was designed, and what appealed to me about it was they didn't say, you've got to go out and convince these communities that they need a land bank. Because some places you're like, oh, I don't want to do that. That's sales. I'm not into sales. I want to educate what the resources are and then show you how to evaluate whether or not it's going to help you or what it can do if you need it. Certainly every community in Pennsylvania doesn't need a land bank.
No, I'm not opposed to it. I'm just
No. No. And that's where you look at the costs and the benefits. Like, why would we put time and effort into developing a land bank if, as you said, we have one blighted property? And if you don't have, then your real estate market's humming along fine, and there's interest and there's value in the properties that are up for sale, and there's not a lot of foreclosed properties that are sitting there, held by banks and in abeyance until they figure out if they want to sell it or if they want to just let it go. So those are all things that you would want to consider if you go forward on it. Anybody else? Great, thank you. It was a pleasure being here tonight with you. If anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.